So as you may have seen, we've recently gotten further reveals on the main systems coming with the first Diablo 4 expansion, Vessel of Hatred. But even though we got the reveals of what systems are coming, these reveals were pretty sparse on specific information. We're actually in luck because around 8 months ago, there was a bunch of leaks pertaining to this first expansion. And now that we have all of these reveals, we know that these leaks from 8 months ago pretty much all ended up being true. So we can look at some specific information from those leaks to piece together more information for this expansion. And the main system I wanted to go over in this video is raids. Now, if you've already looked over the official reveals, you may have realized that nothing is actually called a raid, but one of the new systems coming is described as something that's eerily similar to a raid, and this system currently doesn't have an official name yet. And this system, as described in the official reveals, is a new co-op endgame activity. Party up to take on a new multifaceted dungeon with powerful challenges and promising rewards. First of its kind to Diablo, this dungeon will require eager warriors to team up and take down the challenge together. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been playing MMOs for like 20 years, and this sounds like they're describing a raid. And as mentioned, this is pretty sparse on specifics because I think they're going to want to do a bigger reveal for a lot of these systems leading into the expansion, and I think there's a pretty good chance that this will actually be called a raid. But now we get to jump into the leaks to get some more information on this new endgame system that is eerily similar to raids. Now, the first bit is from some of the original leaks. This was kind of the most detailed leak that also added in like some story elements and stuff like that. And the end of the section kind of going over the story elements in the main campaign ends with this: the Pinnacle of Nahantu's challenges is a new raid centered around Khazra. With 5 wings to conquer, this raid will push even the most seasoned adventurers to their limits. And if you put this right next to this new endgame activity, they sound like they could be the exact same thing. They are mentioned to be raids here, and as we'll go over, a lot of these leaks are actually from files from Blizzard, and in these files, it is actually called a raid. Now, the rest of this leaked or data mined information we're going to be looking at are files from Blizzard, and my understanding of this situation is that Blizzard used the same servers that the Diablo 4 beta tests were hosted on for an internal test for this first expansion. So some people were able to data mine some files from that before it was more locked down. And that's where all of this additional information is going to come from. There's quite a lot more than we're going to go over in this video, but I just wanted to highlight some of the most interesting parts. And I think one of the biggest things, and one of the things I find most interesting, is that in these leaks, it's mentioned that this is a 5-wing raid. And the first thing I think of is Naxxramas from World of Warcraft. You basically enter this raid, you start in the center. There's 4 wings, 1 in each direction. Once you complete all of those wings, they go defeat all those bosses, you come back to the center, and it takes you to what's basically the 5th wing and has the last 2 bosses of the raid right there. And looking through all of these different files and strings, that's something I keep going back to, that this raid seems to be inspired by Naxxramas, at least how it's being laid out within these files. And that's definitely a pretty good raid to get inspired by for the first raid of Diablo 4. But we do have some additional things in these files mentioning this being a winged raid. So first off, we have some mention of raid chests, one being for an end wing reward and one being for a mid wing reward. This does also bring into question how looting and how rewards are actually going to work in a massive raid in Diablo 4. Now, if I would have to guess, what this is probably showing us is that you're just going to be getting additional loot as you get to different sections of the raids. This could also potentially be where like the checkpoints of the raid are. So you complete half a wing, you get a checkpoint with a reward chest, and then you complete the whole wing, you get like another checkpoint kind of and another reward chest. Because I seriously doubt they're going to remove the big loot explosions you get when defeating a difficult boss. This could also just be additional rewards because it also seems like there's going to be some type of trash or events between the different bosses of the raid. This also harkens back to being inspired from Naxxramas. In Naxxramas, you go defeat a boss, then you'll have to do a bunch of trash, or in other WoW raids, you have to do some event, then you get to the next boss. And it seems like when looking at some of these files, that seems to be the case with this raid as well. There's even some mentions of like a holdout event or different things like that. But then we have some additional mention of what could possibly be this raid with different directions. So you'd have different wings. Obviously, each one would be in a different direction. Now, these specific strings could either be what I just mentioned, that this is the different direction and different wings of the raid, or this could also potentially be be one singular boss, one of the first things I thought of when I saw these strings was that this boss would have 5 different platforms in the boss room that he teleports around to, because this has raid boss, boss room center, southwest, southeast, northeast, and northwest. So my first thought was you would go into a boss room, there would be 5 big platforms. The boss would start in the middle, you go to the middle, fight the boss, then the boss would teleport to another platform, and you'd have to do something to get to that boss as well. Maybe there would be different mechanics on all of those different platforms. So it can mean either of those two things. But then we also have something that's very interesting and could potentially show us the actual name of this raid. Now, these first files mention the raid and then the final boss and the souling boss, and it does seem like the souling is either something in the final boss fight or is the final boss itself. But then under this, there's something labeled as Citadel. These are also labeled as bosses, even though this isn't specifically labeled as a raid. It does seem to be that this Citadel thing may be the actual name of the raid. And tying pretty heavily into this is the image they use for these official reveals. Under that paragraph I went over at the start of this video, this image was above it, that if I showed you some pictures and said which one's the Citadel, this is the one you would probably choose. So my guess when looking at this is that the Citadel is going to be the name of this first instance of this new endgame system. Whether they actually call this system a raid or they just call it like co-op dungeons or something, this one is probably going to be named the Citadel. Now, when talking about raids in any RPG, one of the most important parts about them is the boss mechanics, what you're going to be doing while facing these bosses. How interesting are the mechanics? Are you just going up against a meat shield? Is there different mechanics you have to do all throughout the room? Are different people going to be doing different mechanics? And we do have a little bit of information that kind of points to some elements we could potentially be seeing in some of these boss fights. Now, everything we're going to be going over here is labeled as the final boss. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean it's the final boss of the raid. It could be the final boss of a wing, or these could just be some temporary names based on what they were actually testing at the time. Maybe they only had a couple bosses, and for this test, the last boss they had done, they just named as the final boss. So there could be a bunch of different things, but I mainly wanted to look at what some of this is pointing to when it comes to mechanics. Now, the first bit seems to have some boss spells. We have Demon Mega Fire and we have Wide Spell Portal, but the first piece of this is Receptacle Soul Orb. Now, the first thing I thought of is you're doing something to get these soul orbs, and then you're having to go put them in a receptacle, which could be legitimately anything. That name doesn't necessarily mean something, but maybe you're facing a boss and as you get its health down, maybe it drops these soul orbs and you have to go put these soul orbs in a containment unit somewhere or something, and the boss gets weaker and weaker as you do that. But the main thing I wanted to point out is that some of these are seeming to be more intricate and interesting mechanics than most ARPG boss fights we'd be used to, which are basically just dodge stuff and kill the boss. And likewise, we have more mention of soul orbs. So now we have soul orbs with minus pressure, plus pressure, and symbol. And there's a few different things this can mean, but the first thing my mind jumped to is that you're gonna have to take these soul orbs and maybe go place them somewhere that balances out something. So you have minus and plus pressure, and maybe there's like a pressure meter or some pressure gauge in the room, and you have to get these soul orbs and balance out this pressure gauge. So as you're fighting the boss, all these soul orbs are popping off, and as a group, you have to take some of these soul orbs and bring them back to one specific receptacle, and that'll increase the pressure, the other one will reduce the pressure, and maybe you have to balance out this pressure gauge. Maybe as you're doing damage to the boss, you're raising or lowering the pressure, and to keep it balanced out while doing damage, you also have to have somebody constantly running these orbs to these different areas to keep this pressure balanced. And that's just all speculation, but the main thing I wanted to get across is that looking through a lot of these files, specifically when it pertains to these raid bosses, is that it seems like there's going to be more interesting mechanics than just dodge the attacks and kill the boss. It seems like there's going to be more intricate, more MMO-like boss mechanics, which is something I'm definitely a fan of. Played WoW for 19 years. I think WoW is the best raids in gaming, and I think if there's one place Diablo would take inspiration from for the raids, it would obviously be WoW. Now, as we are playing an ARPG, specifically a Diablo game, most Diablo games have a difficulty settings, whether it be world tiers, or it be torment levels, or it be pit levels. There's a bunch of different difficulties for most pieces of a lot of the Diablo games. So it would make sense for this to be included in a raid as well. And looking through these files, it seems like it is. Now, the first one being under monster affix, we have a final boss summoned normal. So this could be either like like the normal version of the boss that doesn't have like any affixes, or this could be one of the difficulties is being named normal. If they were taking a lot of inspiration from WoW, WoW does have normal raids as one of the difficulties, so that could be that. But then we have some additional things, specifically different tiers of the raid. So we have raid tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and tier 5. So this very much looks like there's going to be a bunch of different tiers of difficulty for this raid and for the whole raid system as a whole, which would again make complete sense. And there's a bunch of different ways they could do this. They could do it like WoW, where you go up in difficulty, you just get better gear. You get basically the same gear, but better versions of it. Or they could do what I think is much more probable, in that going up in tiers makes the boss fights much more difficult, but it just gives you more loot. So like tier 0 may be really easy, so everybody could do it, but you get much less loot doing tier 0. So maybe if you get more experience, get better gear, maybe you're now at tier 3, you're getting a bit more loot, and then the absolute meta top tier builds, you're going into tier 5 and just getting ridiculous amounts of loot. Kind of like how the tormented bosses work, just a lot more difficulties to choose from. And I do think that would actually be a much better way to go about raids in Diablo, because this could also allow them to have unique items that only drop in the raid. Because if you have a super easy tier that like anybody can go in and do, you could still very easily add items that only drop in the raid, because there's a difficulty that everybody can go do to at least get some loot. But then as you get higher and higher tiers, it doesn't give better loot, it just gives more loot. And that does bring up the question of the loot, because we don't actually have a ton of information outlining any specific loot. We obviously had the end wing reward and the mid wing reward as well. So it seems like you are going to get rewards for getting to certain checkpoints in every wing of the raid. But then we do have what seems to be some type of crafter specific to the raid, because we have some files mentioning a raid crafter. Specifically, there's also a tier on this. So maybe the raid crafter is actually how you get to bigger tiers of the raid. Maybe you have to complete the lowest tier of the raid, and then you craft an item that lets you get to the next tier. That's a possibility. Or maybe you get materials from the different tiers and you can craft different things. But then we also have a list of crafter tabs. So this seems to be multiple different crafters. There's craft construct items, there's empower items, craft food, corrupt sigils, craft corrupted sigils, and then again we have a raid crafter, but this time under consumables. Now either way we look at this, it does seem like there's going to be some crafter specific to the raid, giving you different raid things, whether it be with materials from the raid or whether you use normal materials to craft things for the raid. But there's the possibility that some of these other crafting lines are new crafters coming, or it could just be that these are just the names they use in the files for the crafters we have in the game right now. Because obviously if they name something in the files something, they don't have to name it that in the actual game we get. So craft food could potentially just be like craft elixirs and incense, or this could actually mean that they're adding like food crafting that'll give you like different buffs or something for the raid. But I do think it's a pretty good chance there is going to be some type of crafter specific to the raid, because then we also have a raid prototype hub, and this is labeled under subzone, so it would make sense that there was some hub to where you can see other people in, to where there are a bunch of crafters kind of tied specifically to the raid. Especially if the raid is really long with a ton of different bosses, you'd want some place to easily be able to go back to maybe get more consumables, repair your armor, stuff like that. And what's even more interesting is this is labeled as raid dungeon prototype hub. And obviously as we went over, they're currently only calling this a co-op dungeon. So just a small little tie-in with the official information we've had revealed so far. So tying all this back in, I think it's a very good chance that this new endgame co-op content is going to be raids. I think there's a pretty good chance that they still call it a raid. Raids are something that get a lot of people very excited, especially pretty much any MMO players. They hear raid, that's something that a lot of people are very interested in and will get pretty hyped for. But no matter if they actually call this content a raid or if they just call it a co-op dungeon, going through all these files, going through all the information we have, no matter what these are called, they still seem like they are going to be what you would expect from a raid. And that's something I'm very excited about. I talked about wanting raids in Diablo 4 before Diablo 4 was even released. You go back to some of my oldest Diablo 4 videos, that's some of the things I mentioned I would very much like to have in Diablo 4. So me personally, I'm very excited for this new endgame system. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.